But what's really funny is when you've done 5 takes and the masturbation has not worked in the first 4, but you've got this incredible moment where actually all of the angles are right, all of the movement is right, all of the sensations are right, and then they don't pick that in the edit. And you're like, that was the one.
My name is Abby, and I'm the voice behind the Evolving Love Project. In this podcast, my husband and I deep dive into the topics of non-monogamy and polyamory, drawing from our experiences of being consensually non-monogamous for almost a decade.
My name is Liam. Whether you're monogamous, polyamorous, curious, or anything in between, we invite you to join us for this conversation.
Let's begin. Elle McAlpine is one of the world's leading intimacy coordinators. She graduated with a first-class degree in writing, directing and performance from York University and has worked as a professional actress in TV, film and theatre in addition to her work as an intimacy coordinator. Some of her work includes Channel 4 HBO's It's a Sin, Gentleman Jack 2, Brave New World and Roadkill. Together with fellow intimacy coordinator Catherine Hardman, they founded EK Intimacy.
Most recently, Elle was the Intimacy Coordinator for Best Picture Oscar-nominated Poor Things, starring Emma Stone. The director, Yorgos Lanthimos, had this to say: "I have to credit Elle McAlpine, our Intimacy Coordinator. At the beginning, this profession felt a little threatening to most filmmakers, but I think it's like everything. If you're with a good person, it's great, and you realize you actually need them. She made everything much easier for everyone." And with that, we bring you our conversation with Elle McAlpine.
Elle, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. We've been really looking forward to speaking with you and your very exciting work, which we would love to learn more about. So, Elle, you are an intimacy coordinator. Would you be able to share with our listeners what your job entails?
Yes, absolutely. Well, hello, both of you. Thank you so much for having me on your wonderful show. So an intimacy coordinator is essentially three things. We are advocates for actors working in the TV and film industry when it comes to working on intimate content, intimate scenes. So that means we ensure that boundaries and consent are communicated ahead of creating the scene. We help liaise between all heads of department and production about anything regarding the intimate content. So we'll talk very closely with your directors, producers, costume departments, makeup departments, prop departments, VFX departments sometimes, location, depending on where we're doing the sex scene. So we kind of coordinate between all those departments to ensure that everybody is prepped ahead of getting to set, so that when we get to set, the scene is dealt with efficiently, and yes, we're not beating around the bush. And then the third sort of section of the work is we're choreographers essentially. So we help choreograph sex scenes if directors would like our help. And we help, we help sort of talk about or interrogate what the intimate and sexual storytelling is in TV and film, even in theatre sometimes, like the importance of the stories that we are telling through intimacy and through sexual expression. So we bring that conversation, that dialogue, that vocabulary to set.
So how did you find yourself in this career path? Have you always been interested in becoming an intimacy coordinator, or is this something that has kind of organically happened for you?
It's one of those I used to get so frustrated when people who had a job that I wanted would be like, I just fell into it. And it actually, that actually did happen to me. So I was sort of reflecting on my life as a child, and I have a business partner, Kat Hardman, and we were doing some business coaching with someone, and we were talking about ourselves when we were little, and we were both the children that always talked really openly about sex and would educate our friends and in whatever way those little girls could. But I came from a very open family. My mum actually went through a period of life designing erotic bed linen. So we'd have these amazing artists come over to the house, and they would just be creating this erotic bed linen, and it was very much part of my kind of upbringing, I think. And I think I was always interested in it, and always interested in in sex and in, I guess, just expression through your body, and how we communicate physically. You know, I'm a trained actor, so I kind of went my more conformist part of my personality was like, what kind of path do I need to go on? Okay, well, I'll do acting because that's where I feel safe and that's what excites me. So I trained as an actor and I worked as an actor for, and I still am really, but for predominantly about nearly 10 years. And during that time I didn't go to drama school initially, but then I lost my voice when I was doing a play. So I thought, right, I need to go and get some vocal training. So I went to drama school and I met Ita O'Brien, who founded intimacy coordination essentially in the UK. She pioneered it, and it was at the beginning of her work. And as I was graduating, she wanted to essentially start showing her work to the industry. And so I worked for her as an actor, just doing sex scene after sex, well, simulated, but a lot of sex scenes. And I remember I did one of the first workshops I did with her was in front of the Sunday Times newspaper, and it was for the magazine, and they were doing a piece on intimacy coordinators, or they weren't called that at the time, it was like new people in intimacy or whatever. And I did a scene from a play called Cowboy Mouth, and in that play there's a very, very explicit sex scene, and I did it with a friend of mine from drama school, and we worked on it with an amazing director. We were fully clothed, and we were in like sort of, you know, workout gear. And we did the workshop not in front of the press, but then the press came in to look at what we'd created. And so we did our scene, and I remember we were kind of I was mid-climax, and the photographer kind of came down onto the floor and took this photograph. And I remember thinking, oh fuck, he'll use that. He'll absolutely use that. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later in the Sunday Times magazine, there was just like a double page spread of this photograph. And I was like, oh God. The thought I had before was, oh my God. But then I looked at the image and I was just kind of mesmerized by it. I was like, wow, that's really, really great. I mean, I looked like a monster. I had my veins popping out of my neck. I didn't look like myself. But I think because of the process with which we had created that, because of how in character, of how safe the environment was where we'd created that scene, I was just so proud. And I thought to myself, you know, I'd had experiences as an actor beforehand where I'd watched the sex scenes that I'd done back and was just like, I am so uncomfortable. And just looking at that image, I was just like, gosh, if that can happen for me, I want to be able to share this with other actors, because it's such an amazing thing to be able to do. And so then I started working for Ita, and I just kind of got thrown on a few sets, and then I learned how to do my job.
So you are coming to this from such an amazing place of your own lived experience. Like, you've been in those vulnerable, you know, situations. You've been, you know, the actor, you've been a part of it. I mean, I feel like that would just be so necessary to be in this line of work. When did intimacy coordination become more of a thing for films? Was there a time when there weren't intimacy coordinators and it was just sort of between directors and then actors and people coming in, you know, in place of the actor? Was that happening for quite a long time?
It became a bit more of a role in the States first, but for just speaking for the UK, it started to become a kind of professional job in 2018. So it was the first series of sex education, where they hired an intimacy coordinator, and that was Ita who trained me. And before then, it was up to the director. And sometimes I was talking the other day about who else was held accountable, or at least who else was protecting the actors, and it was often the costume departments, because they build such great relationships with their actors, because they're very close to them and they dress them, and you know, it's very intimate, that job. They were usually finding themselves in positions where they'd have to hold hold people's vulnerabilities, even to sit on monitor. And, an actor could say, could you just make sure that they don't use or they don't get a shot of my bum or whatever it is. And so the costume department would have to be there, and that they're not trained in it. And then they also don't have the language, and they also don't necessarily have the authority to go to a director and say, you can't shoot that because the actor has told me not, that they don't want that shot. So, when I first started working, I had some really interesting conversations with costume, being like, thank God you're here, because it's fallen on our shoulders to protect these people. And that's not okay, really. But yeah, very, very new. So only from 2018.
It's such a big responsibility. You're holding the consent of the actors. You're making, creating as safe a space as possible for everybody. I'm sure that the process, leading up to a scene, there would be so many discussions and meetings, or just so many vulnerable conversations. I'm sure you'd be holding a lot of emotional space for people as well, just in the process of discussing consent and boundaries. Another thing that I'm thinking about is the fluidity of consent. Consent is an active, it's active, it's alive. So I'm sure there's probably been some situations where something has probably been, agreed upon, but then in the moment, if something's not feeling right, or maybe the other way, there had been specific boundaries, but then the comfort levels of the actor might change as they relax and get to know, who they're working with.
It's actually one of the most important things about what we do. And we have a lot of paperwork in place for this job because there's a lot of liability at hand. So we have to have to protect ourselves as much as we have to protect the actors. But within that paperwork, we use a phrase that consent is continuous, essentially, so that they might have agreed to something, but this is in our risk assessments, this can change on the day. What I love is when you have conversations. So a lot of our work is in the prep. So as you say, it's fluid. So, you could prep really, really well, and all these conversations could feel very embodied, and you could, actors could be completely set on something that they're going to do and really happy with it. And then you get to set, and just because, for whatever reason, something could have happened 2 days before, something they could be on for a female identifying person, a woman could be on her period. You just don't know. There's so many factors that could change the way in which these actors want to sculpt a scene. So we always say that. We always kind of bookmark each day with consent is fluid, is continuous. Please let us know if anything changes. But what I was going to say is that I love it when your actor has such high reservations, and you obviously put in place everything that you can to ensure that they're not taken advantage of, or that you don't shoot something that's outside of their consent. And it's getting harder because we have to put in a lot of paperwork in the sense of nudity riders and simulated sex riders, which basically are assigned documentation that says they are happy to do this, they are not happy to go outside of this. And then you get to set and they're like, oh, it's fine, I don't mind. And you're like, oh my God, okay, well, we're going to have to change all this paperwork. But it's wonderful because you kind of realize that the work itself is creating a safe enough space for somebody who had a preconceived idea of what they might be comfortable with. And that's altered in the moment. But you then also have to be careful, because you have to say to them, okay, I hear you and I feel you and I sense that this is really, really, you're really comfortable doing this. But just remember, this is going on television, or this is going, and then that person that had slight reservations about it, when you're outside of the creative space, because we all know that, right? Sometimes even if it's a personal experience that you're having sexually or with somebody, sometimes if that space has not been held properly, you can come away, and the next couple of days you can start to kind of build a narrative around something that is either was true or wasn't true, but something inside you didn't feel held enough, or felt that so I always sort of try and hold the vulnerability that was beforehand as well, if there is changing, and just just having a conversation about what was that rooted in, why do you think it's changed now, and then again you kind of have to then say in your paperwork what happened and why it's gone completely outside of what they initially agreed to.
So ultimately, you actually give them the authority to change their level of comfortability within the moment. Is there ever a time when you actually go, even though you've changed what you're comfortable with, I actually don't think that you should do this, because I think that this may be something that you regret, maybe you're in the moment, maybe the kind of the intensity of the scene has kind of swept an actor up, and you're kind of looking in as this bird's eye protector role almost, and you think, actually, maybe this has crossed a line into something that, even though they may feel an embodied sense of comfort and consent, you actually can see some of the other forces at play?
Yeah, it's a great question. 100%. And what helps me is the paperwork side of it. So I can say legally, we are legally bound to keep this scene within the parameters of what we have agreed. And because again, it's very complex and nuanced, isn't it? Because it's your projection of something that might not also be true. And so you have to be really careful about not assuming that what your view of it's really hard. It's really difficult because you have to also, you want to give actors and directors the agency to do what they want, but also you have an understanding of everybody's vulnerabilities and boundaries that they've spoken to you about privately. And sometimes actually it goes even further, which is a power dynamic in the space can happen that an actor suddenly feels like they can't hold their boundary because they want to impress. They want to go even further than and so you have to be the one that's like, no, this is the paperwork. Essentially, I use the paperwork. I'm like, it is the paperwork. And if I feel, I mean, I don't know, I get very, I'm quite a physical person. So I'll get like, the sort of the back of your neck feels uncomfortable, like just the surge of sensation. And I'll listen to that because I'm like, something feels off here. But the communication that I utilize around it is why the paperwork is so great for us. And it sounds so boring, but it just really helps. It helps sort of anchor it in, I guess, in like the whole experience, as opposed to just that one sudden moment when suddenly somebody feels so embodied and so like creatively free that they do something that actually they might not necessarily like when they see it on screen a year later.
Because you mentioned power dynamics, and I imagine that you're actually balancing so many different on a set. You're actually balancing so many different dynamics. You have the people who are in the crew, you have the people in the cast, and then even people within the cast. You've got supporting actors, and then you have maybe the lead actors, and there's a power dynamic there, and then you have the director, and there's a power dynamic there, and then of course you are on set, and you have your own power dynamics with all the various people. How do you go about those, managing kind of that very delicate balance between all those dynamics at play?
Yeah, you can come away feeling completely exhausted sometimes because you're like, oh my God. This is actually, I think, I get asked a lot, like, what makes you good at this job? And I think actually that's the crux of it, Liam, like being able to, essentially, it's not, I thought at the beginning it was about like relinquishing all of my own ego and all of my own stuff just to support. And actually it's not about that. It's being really rooted in like, in my own power dynamics, as you say, in my own understanding of where I sit within the hierarchy, and also where I feel less able to assert my authority, and like really work on that, because they can be really intimidating places. And ultimately you are protecting people, and you have to be able to stand your ground in certain situations. But also creative spaces are so fluid. You can't be too dominant. You can't bring in an energy that is a policing energy, because then you're not going to get the best out of your actors, and you're actually not going to create something that you're proud of in terms of like the intimate storytelling. So it's really difficult, but I think it's ultimately understanding that you're all human beings, and that we're all here we're all here to create something. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're creating content. Like, we're not saving lives. But there is an element of pressure always. And I think to be good at this job, you have to have an acute understanding of energies and like an energetic exchange, and understanding, people's intention and people's jobs also on like a very tangible level. Like, what do they do? How can they assist? what is an actor responsible for, what is a director responsible for, having complete understanding of what you're responsible for, and then letting the rest of it kind of fly and hope for the best.
You would need so much intuition, so much being just in tune to everything that's happening, like having eyes all over the place. And when you're meeting with directors, I mean, you would be, interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you as well, because you would want to be, I'm sure, making sure that you're working with a director who, won't go rogue or, has their own sort of agenda. Do you find that, really finding the right relationship is incredibly important?
Absolutely. And I think the more I do this, it's interesting, the evolution of the role, because essentially at the beginning, we were not only kind of advocating for actors and productions, we were also advocating for ourselves because it was a new job and the industry was still very archaic, and it was there was so much energy going behind why you can benefit from having us, how we can help. And that was exhausting. And now it's changed. Now, as you say, Abby, it feels more like a chemistry read when we're talking to the directors. It's like, do we get on? Do you feel that, I'll always sort of start the conversation with how would you like me to work? What works for you in terms of like creating something, and really understanding their own unique process when working with actors, because some directors have a very, very wonderful understanding of working with actors. Some directors don't. Some directors are very, very technical, and they look at things more from a kind of camera, lighting, set that kind of access to what they're trying to do. Sorry, that was my dog. So you have to sort of understand where they're coming from and how you can then complement their process, and where you feel they might be lacking in terms of, I don't know, skill or practice, and how you can then enhance it by the work that you do. So yeah, it's ever changing. Our process is very fluid in and of itself.
Have you ever been in a situation where, the director has booked you to be the intimacy coordinator, but then the actors maybe feel like they don't necessarily need one, or they have experience, or like, has that ever come up for you?
Yeah, it has. And it's, I always say to, especially with actors, it's like, look, I'm here, I'm being paid to be here. Again, how can I serve you in the way that you need? Because I appreciate that, not all actors have a blanket approach either. And some people are still very, they don't want to talk about sex. They just want to get on with it. And so you come up against that sometimes. It's like, we're doing a sex scene, but they don't want to talk about it. It'd be like you're doing a scene, I don't know, cooking an omelette. This is a strange example, but you just don't want to talk about cooking
let's
the
go
omelette.
with it.
Yeah, let's go with it. Like we're not actually going to talk about the thing that we're doing. And so you kind of come across actors that just don't want to engage. They just want to. That's actually very rare. It's more directors that are like, oh, I feel uncomfortable. You do the scene, and I'll just watch. And it's like, okay, but that already has an energy behind it. Your actors aren't going to do what you want them to do if you don't want to even interrogate the scene or kind of question what's the purpose of this scene. Like, why are we adding this scene to the story if you don't want to engage in it?
Because there is this misconception, and I've certainly felt it, that when you watch movie and you see all these movie stars and they're on screen, you just assume that it's an incredibly sex positive culture, and that all these actresses and actors kind of come with this amazing ability just to shed all their vulnerability, and they walk into a scene and go, I'm here to have sex. It's like this kind of these misconceptions. But I imagine you're often coming across people who have really, just like all of us, have really complicated relationships to sex. So how do you have those initial conversations? Like when you're first meeting, maybe they're a leading actor, or you're having these initial conversations and trying to gauge where they're at with their comfort levels. How do you kind of start broaching the topics?
Well, I think what's wonderful about what I do is that I already have so much context. So because of the scripts, and if writers have done their due diligence and really, really questioned, what is the point of a sex scene? And not all of them do this, but it's getting better. Like, why is there a sex scene here? As long as it's not kind of titillating or kind of just there for a purpose, like a punctuation mark, then often I will sort of open the conversation with, what are your opinions on the kind of sexual expression in this? Like, the intimacy. And, you know, it's not always about the actual penetrative moment. It's like the scenes before then, the scenes after those. Like, it's so embodied in all of like the relationship essentially. And it's talking about, you know, what kind of, I heard the other day an actor say that they access their character through working out what their sexual expression is. And I love that, because what are we like as people in private? You know, I did at drama school, we did this thing called an object exercise and a relationship exercise, where you essentially have to do three things, but you're observed, and it's like physically doing something. So you could be arranging a table for a dinner party, and it's like the way in which you do things is access to your character. And this particular actor was like the sexual expression, because it's such a private moment, but you're ultimately being observed in that private moment. There's obviously a nuance there, right? But it's like, what can this particular scene tell me about the character that I'm playing? And so accessing it through that, like talking to actors about that, really generates their imagination and gets them really excited about their characters. And most actors will be happy to talk about it in that capacity. And, you know, we root it in character so that it doesn't become personal. But the more I do this work, I'm like, actors some are very method, so they are very much in character, but a lot of actors, especially younger actors now, are cast for who they are, and that's ultimately why they are playing the characters that they're playing. So they bring their own personal experience to these parts, and so you have to engage with them on a kind of personal level, and also with their boundaries. Like, you know, your character might be doing something in the script, but what are your personal boundaries around that? So they might be having the script might say they're having a particular type of sex. Are you happy as a performer to engage in that sort of intimacy? Because ultimately it actually might be for their person something that they're not comfortable with. And so it's how do you attune the personal with the character and make sure that the actor themselves feels comfortable enough to kind of creatively explore what the character is doing.
And if there is that sense of discomfort, so maybe there is that kind of disparity between what they're comfortable with in their personal life and what is expected of them within what's in the script, how does that then get managed? Is it something that you go to the director, you go, you know, this particular actor doesn't feel comfortable with this? Is there a way that we can modify this? How do you kind of navigate those territories?
I always say to the directors, an actor's no or an actor's boundary is a gift, because it actually allows us to pivot, and it can create something far more interesting that you might not even have thought about. So it's just like gauging with them. Okay, is this a boundary because you have a judgment about the sex, or is this genuinely a boundary for you and your body and what you're willing to kind of engage with another human in the space? And if it's a judgment about the sex, like you can interrogate that, like why, what is it? And if it's, most of the time, if the script is good enough, if the characters are developed enough, actors won't have that problem, because they'll be like, of course, that absolutely serves the story. That absolutely serves the character. Of course, they're going to engage in that kind of intimacy. Equally, with a lot of scripts, it just says they have sex. So there's already like space for creativity to happen. And we can all engage in a conversation about what kind of sex is happening. But yeah, an actor's boundary is a gift, because the minute that they feel safe and they feel free and they feel comfortable, they'll probably go a lot further than your own idea of what you wanted anyway, because they feel safe enough to do that. So yeah, that's what it's usually utilizing their boundary as a creative tool.
And so with the boundaries and the relationships and what they might be comfortable with, you know, on set, and then, you know, that might be different to their personal life. You know, it just makes me think a little bit about, you know, the relationships beyond them as well, you know, in their personal lives. You know, has there ever been a situation where an actor has, you know, done a scene or they've felt great about it and everything's been signed off, and then, you know, a week later or the next day they come back and they say, oh, you know, I actually spoke to my partner and they're not comfortable with, can we like do it again or make a change? Has that ever been something that's come up?
Not for me personally, but my business partner, Kat, she worked with an actress who did this. It was a supporting artist, so they just literally essentially came in to do the sex scene. And apparently it was an amazing sex scene. It was sort of rooted in comedy, but it was really fun. And she had gone home and had then been with her son, who was a baby, I think. And suddenly all of the kind of anxiety and the worry about what was going to be on screen kind of came up, and like what potentially her child could see of her. And so Kat, was amazing and did what she said. So we managed to get the rushes, we managed to get the kind of cut, and she could see the scene. And actually, because of how great she felt around how it was all handled, she watched it and was like, "Oh, it's actually brilliant and hilarious," and I'm really happy about it. So usually, if the day has been handled well, if the prep has been handled well, but they still got reservations, and you show them the cut, they usually, because we also wouldn't let something go that didn't look right. Coming back and reshooting it is hard because of money and time, etc. But often, if you give them access to it and let them see, they can kind of. Most of the time, I think they're usually like, "Oh yeah, it's fine. It's actually brilliant. It looks great."
So after a scene, will there often be time to have a big chat afterwards, like an aftercare, check in and just see how everyone felt? And is it commonplace that actors would actually want to see all of that footage and be a part of any decision makings around what might end up in the final cut?
If they're an exec producer on it, then absolutely. A lot of the time they don't want to see it. They just want to. We'll do like a feedback report essentially. So we will message them or call them a couple of days after just to see how they've got on, and if they have any feedback about how, especially if you're working on a TV series where you could be doing ample scenes with them. It's about working out, okay, how was that for you that day? Is there anything you want to do differently? How would you like the intimacy handled in the next block, etc., etc. So it's a constant conversation. Or if it's their one and only scene, it's just ensuring that they feel happy with the day, with the way that the day went. If they have any kind of anything that they want to report, so that it could be down to, I felt uncomfortable with how many crew were there or whatever, and you can kind of reflect that back to the production. And so it's really, really important. That wraparound care is so important. It's very much we prep really, really efficiently the day on set, and then we have a really kind of efficient follow-up procedure afterwards, just to ensure that that their thoughts and wants are heard.
So, Elle, you mentioned that, of course, you're an actress as well, and I was wondering, you mentioned doing some theatre acting as well as doing other sorts of acting. Do you notice any difference in the way that theatre actors kind of approach consent as compared to people acting within movies or television series?
Yeah, I think with theatre performers and actors, they've already got a very because they've often, well, not necessarily been to drama school, but the creative landscape of working in theatre is that it's big, it's bold, it's you're playing. There's a lot of play and a lot of exploration and a lot of conversation, I think, and communication, which would involve conversations around consent and boundaries, etc. I think when you get to set, or when you work in TV and film, it's so time stringent. There's so little time to actually engage in those really exciting conversations, which is why we do it before, so we can kind of have access. But a lot of actors, I don't know, working in TV and film is so internal. It's like you can't always be big and bold, but it's why, and I'll talk about Poor Things now, but it's why Poor Things was so great, because it was almost theatrical. Like, it was so, that particular film that I worked on was so expressive. It was so over the top. It wasn't based in like naturalism, realism, which is where our content is going. It's all about, and as I alluded to earlier, actors getting cast for who they are, so that they just play themselves. There's no kind of exploration of like characters and what's going on, I don't know, when character acting essentially. But I think there's a freedom in theatre, and you have a lot more time to explore things and to have these conversations on the day or when you're in the rehearsal space. In TV and film, you've got maybe half an hour.
Well, the freedom is a really interesting thing because I imagine with freedom, often that can imply a sense of improvisation from the actors. So in a theater context, that might be kind of micro improvisations on stage when the actual performance is happening, and in a film context, it might be the cameras rolling, and an actor, if they're going method, might decide to kind of push things in an interesting way. How do you balance negotiating consent when there's improvisation involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. So essentially, if I know that a director likes to work off impulse or an actor likes to work off impulse, you don't ever want to suppress that at all. That's not what you want to do. But
Mm,
you want to first get it out in the space. Like, this is kind of how we work, and talk about that. So that there's been a dialogue and a
mm,
communication around that kind of way of working. Um, if you've got an actor who doesn't work on impulse and one that does, you'd always go with the person that doesn't, so that we just create a safe enough space for them, because ultimately you can improvise within the boundaries, right? So I think well, the most important thing
mm,
is sculpting something. So it's a bit like a dance. So when you're working with dancers, or a bit like a fight scene, because there is risk at play, because you've got with fight scenes, you've got physical injury, that is a risk. With sex scenes, you have
mm,
emotional well-being and mental injury at risk here, because you don't know who you're working with. So you have to try and mitigate that risk. And to mitigate that risk, you have to put in place boundaries, and often a physical score. So you will sculpt something, so you'll choreograph something essentially that is maybe, just to your point, like if we're working with people that like to improvise, it's like, okay, let's have a basic structure here. So within this structure that we have now created together, you of course are able to improvise. However, we will do body scans. We will ensure that the touch that is felt. So if it's improvisational, I will do a full body
mm,
scan. So it's almost like an agreement and consent of touch. So we'll just touch the whole body. The other person will guide the other person's hand, or if there's more people, we'll just do full body scans of everyone, so that you
Hmm.
felt that
mm,
touch as performers, and you've okayed that touch, which means that when maybe when you're improvising something, that actor knows that they're able to touch there because you've already agreed it in the space. We will
Mm.
mm,
understand, okay, this is the journey of the scene, so we need to get from here to here, and we need to get from here to here through this sort of action. And so we will then like look to kind of create that, as I said, that sort of physical score. And then usually what happens is, which is quite interesting, is that they usually remain within that framework. They'll just perform. It's the performance that is impulsive.
Mm.
mm,
um and I worked with an actor who said something so amazing. He was like, you're allowed to improvise, but you have to, when it comes to sex scenes, it's what is improvised is your thinking, and the energy with which
Mm.
you do the scene, not the physical score. Because when it comes to touch, and when
Mm.
it comes
mm.
to working with other bodies in the space, that has to be pretty set in stone, so that everybody knows what's going on, so that they're not surprised by something, or something is misleading. It's very clear, like, this is our structure, this is our physical score. Oh my gosh, act your heart out, please. Improvise in your acting, in the way in which you're communicating this through your
Mm.
face, through your energy, but keep this structure as is, so that everybody's clear.
Thank you for listening to the Evolving Love podcast. A quick reminder, if you're loving this conversation, hit subscribe and drop a comment on your podcast platform.
If you are interested in receiving 2 extra premium podcast episodes each month, you can become a premium subscriber at evolvingloveproject.substack.com. Now let's get back to the conversation.
Because you mentioned Ida O'Brien, was it, who kind of pioneered this in England? Before she was doing her work, kind of setting up this framework of intimacy coordinators, what was the landscape like for actors coming onto set? Like if they're coming onto set and they've got a director who is known for their improvisatory nature, and presumably that would be quite a nervous space for an actor to go into.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard the anecdotes, haven't we? You've got the
Mm,
director who directed Blue is the Warmest Color, and he just rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled, and they just had to engage in hours of simulated action that ultimately left them feeling scarred, that ultimately left that sex scene feeling very uncomfortable to watch, and also not rooted in truth or even how lesbians have sex. Like, it was the stereotypical, because it's the male gaze, and it's like, okay. And even actors, the Last Tango in Paris scene where Marlon Brando and I can't remember for the life of me the director. Sorry, my name's all over the place. But they had, the director and the actor had a private conversation without the female actress knowing, about a slab of, like, using butter as lubrication, and essentially he did it in the scene. And you have this very authentic moment from this actress where she's like completely in shock, and you believe it because it's actually real. And she's crying real tears, and you just think, for what reason? You've just actually, I don't think she worked again. She was 17 years old, and she never ever worked again. And yeah, the landscape, I think, wasn't great. Or I've had it when I was told by a director, just go and work it out between you. And then the line is so blurred then, because you've not got a third party helping guide you through the sex scene. You're using just yourselves. Then you're feeling very unsafe and confused, because you've just gone through this whole experience of, like, essentially doing a lot of intimacy together, but there's nobody holding you in that, or it's not rooted in professionalism. It feels very, very unsafe. And then you get confused, and then you're upset, and then you feel like you've cheated or whatever. You've had, like, if you've got a partner and you're doing it with somebody, you feel, it feels very unprofessional. And so, yeah, essentially it's unsafe. And, 30 years ago, they didn't have fight coordinators or stunt coordinators. And you couldn't imagine set now without people doing those fight scenes. People would get hurt. They still are getting hurt, but at least there's some level of protection,
You mentioned the male gaze. What's the percentage of intimacy coordinators who are male versus female? Is it a very female-led industry? And if so, what do you think are the strengths of that?
Yeah, it's incredibly female-led. There are amazing male ICs out there, and I think there needs to be more. I think from having conversations with the male ICs that I know, sets and crew are very male heavy. So by adding another male body to the space, especially if you've got a heterosexual relationship, you've then only got one female body in the space. And so you've got a male IC, a male director, a male DOP, male crew, and then one woman. And it's that's not the energy. It's just that it's like, we all have masculine and feminine energy within us, but that masculine energy is then kind of over. It's too much. And I think what female, and that's not to say that some female ICs aren't very heavy in their masculine energy. Like, they can be, especially coming from stunts as well. Like, some of them are very rooted in that kind of like order, linear, strict kind of rule, which doesn't always bode well in the creative space. However, I understand why they feel they need to do that or assert that kind of authority. But I think with female ICs, there is then less gender disparity, because you've got a female crew. You've got a quality of, I guess, just not, because I think men have this. I think men have this too, but there's a more of a nurturing, I guess, quality that the role demands. But also, I think it's mainly to do really with the crew, the gender disparity in the crew. I don't think male ICs are any less good at the job. I just think that with having a female IC, you've just got a much higher chance of having it's very likely that you're going to have a pretty heavy male crew, and by having a female IC, you will loosen that a bit.
With this nurturing and the connection that you'd have with the actor, I'm sure that, with all of the vulnerability, by the end of working together, I'm sure you could become quite close friends, because you've sort of been in this world together that isn't the real world, and you would have, you'd understand each other in ways and talk about personal things that would come up. And it's very bonding having these conversations around consent and boundaries. I'm interested to know, do you always have to be booked by the director, or is it commonplace after a while that certain actors might say, this is my intimacy coordinator, I am coming in to be in this film, and this is who I'm bringing with me to keep me safe?
Yeah, that kind of seems to be the way it's going. that actors will say to you, I don't want to work with anybody else, or they've had experiences with other ICs and then they've had an experience with you and they're like, oh, I really want to work with you again. Because I also feel, you can't expect to get on with every single human being, and you can't expect for what you bring to resonate with every single actor. It might not, it might fall short, and that's actually also okay. There's so much pressure, I think, just across the world to like be the best at what you do and be across the board the best, and that's not realistic, because what you bring to a set one day might be entire in terms of like the energy and the tools that you're bringing might not work for another set. But yeah, there are some actors who you obviously bond with on a much deeper level, maybe just because of the nature of how many scenes they're having to do, and like how much you're working with them, but also just by who you are and what you're interested in. And, Kat and I, we have very similar processes, but the actors that we bond with are different because of just the who we are as human beings, and I think that's also really exciting, and that's okay. And it's not so you don't have to be, everybody's go-to person.
So you mentioned in your upbringing you had a mother who loved erotic linen, and I'm wondering. Obviously, you've gone into acting as well, so you have this particular disposition to being really open-minded about this. But what informed you? What other things informed you in a way that allows you to move into these spaces with such an ability to be non-judgmental about different processes and different people's comfort levels and abilities with these things?
I think I'm very, very interested, always have been, in human beings, and I've always been that person that, my partner always says this. He's like, you just walk into a room and people tell you things, but you don't even know them, and people tell you things. Yeah, I get the sense that Abby was probably quite similar. It's just that, I guess, that openness to see people for where they're at, and never judge them for that, and not, I guess. I think where my work has been as a human being is to actually find my thoughts and my feelings, and I'm very, very able to open up to others and be kind and embracing of all of everybody else, but my wants and my desires and my needs I really struggle with, and this work has made me really fine tune those. So it's been an amazing kind of alchemy of like, I was meant to do this job because it's taught me so much about myself as a human being, and where I need to kind of, what I want essentially. And I think being the people maybe that Abby and I are, it's like you hold other people's desires, beautifully, and you can really accept them. But I don't know if you're the same as this, Abby. I don't think, but my it's like, where am I in that? And I get better at this job the more I hold my kind of, I guess, my wants and my desires, and the way I'm able to assert those in the space and talk and be vulnerable myself with other people. But I think I've always had a curiosity around, sex and intimacy, more intimacy, I think, than sex. Like, how do you become intimate with somebody? And does it always need to be through, and this is what's great about storytelling. It's like you can explore those moments of intimacy. It can be in a touch, it can be in a conversation, it can be in bodies in space and the proximity of those bodies in space. Like, you don't always have to go to the full act to kind of create that amazing sensation that we get when we watch something and we're like, whoa. It's not always the kind of physical penetrative, like that moment of penetration, that gets us. It's usually where our imagination takes us when you allude to something, and that's just purely in content making. But that's what's exciting.
Do you ever have to go out and do some like field research for yourself, like go and participate in some workshops or go to a shibari thing, or if there's like a BDSM performance to go to, or different events where there is real live sex happening, to sort of go and see what's happening? Do you ever have to do that sort of workshop, that sort of field research?
All tax deductible, I'm sure.
Yeah, just tell my accountant, what is this, Elle? Oh, you don't want to know. Yeah, absolutely. And we've recently been mentoring 3 new ICs, and with that we brought in lots of specialists, so kink specialists, BDSM specialists. I mean, predominantly just to talk about their work, but absolutely, like, the more you can, when you work in the creative industries, the more inspiration and I guess just experiences that you can have, the better. I was asked a question the other day about, can a straight heterosexual IC work on a bisexual scene? And I did think, I was like, oh gosh, we always like working with labels is interesting in and of itself anyway, but I don't. It's essentially
Mm.
human expression, and if you haven't necessarily had an experience where, if you're working on a sex scene but you haven't actually had that experience yourself, I don't necessarily feel like you need that. I feel like you need to interrogate it, understand it, look at it,
Mm.
ask questions about it, be curious about it. Don't hold any judgment around it, of course. But if you're working with bisexual or queer or trans actors and they would prefer somebody who has that experience, then of course. But if it's the other way around, if it's you as an IC who's working on a queer scene or whatever, a trans scene, like, you don't necessarily have to have had that experience, but you just need to be curious about that experience, and not necessarily, you're there essentially to hold their boundaries and not project any judgment onto it, but hold the space for people to create that kind of scene. But it is an interesting conversation, I think, because maybe the more ICs that are around, the more people will want ICs of a certain, I don't know, a certain sexual demographic. I'm not really sure, but we'll see.
It seems like there's a huge overlap between BDSM, the way someone would approach a BDSM scene in terms of figuring out boundaries, comfort levels, consent, having that pre-discussions to have a great BDSM scene, and kind of the role of an intimacy coordinator. Have you kind of checked out any of the literature in terms of like books like Wheel of Consent or The Ethical Slut or any of these types of things?
Yes, I have. The Wheel of Consent, absolutely, and I'm always open
Mm,
to more literature. I mean, I think I focused predominantly on, I've read the Body Keeps the Score, more in terms of like what happens to the bodies
Mm.
when you, like,
mm.
in terms of trauma and where you hold it. But any kind of literature, if you guys
Mm.
have any literature that's, it's so essential, I think, to be curious about this sort of stuff. It's obviously very different. I mean, I don't know how you guys work, but reading something and then having a felt sense and understanding and like an embodied sense of it, they're two very different
Mm.
things. And ultimately, we're working with bodies in space. So it's understanding how the body moves and how the body interacts when working with BDSM, etc., etc. And having or with any kind of sexual expression, but having a theoretical understanding is incredibly important. Even I did Gentleman Jack, which is a queer series set in 19th century, maybe 18th century York. And it was looking at, like, researching the sexual expression at that time and understanding,
Mm.
with culture and how, and just in terms of the world in which they were living in and how lesbians operated at that time, how that then informs the sexual storytelling that you're telling, and like what little bits of interesting kind of movement you could do, and I think you learn that through theory, through understanding, like, culturally what happens within the BDSM community or within the kink industry or whatever. There's like so much to learn. Yeah, so any literature, I think, is always beneficial.
Because, of course, with a new industry, which I guess the kind of intimacy coordinator is, and as there's more experiences with intimacy coordinators on set, I imagine you all kind of have like a little community where you can kind of compare notes, almost like psychiatrists. And, they go, oh, I have this patient and this is how I handled this. And I kind of managed to work around that. Is that something that you've noticed as it's become more commonplace to have intimacy coordinators? You're kind of building this really nice network around the world, I'd imagine.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what I always sort of think is, and why I think the job has led to a lot of ICs burning out or getting overwhelmed, it's because that they don't have that sense of community. Because there's nobody. With therapists, with psychiatrists, they have a superior essentially, or they have someone, not a superior, but they have someone that they talk to. That therapists have therapists. They have to have someone that they
Mm.
interrogate their practice with. And ICs, there are some, but like for us, especially the first movement of ICs, which happened in 2017, there's nobody that's done this longer, really, than me and the people that work
Mm.
within this. So I don't have anyone that has experienced everything that I'm coming up against. And so you're having to deal with it on your, what feels like on your own, because you're on set on your own. But, you know, I've got Kat and we've created our business together. And then we've got people who we really trust, and people who the industry is very, very community based. But within that, there's conflict, and within that there's disagreement, and I always think that there's that's beautiful, because there's room for people to expand their practice and to get better at what they do, and to also just have their own opinion, and that's fine. But it's interesting working with a predominantly female community, and what comes with that, and what, you know, I think women are phenomenal, and I think women have to do a lot of work to not, I think this, I'm going to be careful what I say here, not fall into, like, to create a sisterhood, to create an energy that is nurturing, that is like free of envy and bitterness and I don't know, I think women can be really difficult to work with. And you have to really, and I love women, and I'm one of 3 sisters, and women are such important people in my lives. And you have to but people have to do the work to create community. You know, you have to be active participants in community. You have to create the community you want to see. And that is a whole other job in and of itself.
Yeah, I imagine it being incredibly intense if you have been, you know, working through with an actor, and, you know, there's so much giving. You're holding so much space for people. You're just on the whole time. And then what sort of would happen at the end of that for you personally, when you're probably in a situation, I'm sure there are times where, you know, you'd be signing NDAs, you can't really talk about different experiences, you know, and with, you know, intimacy as well, there, I could imagine there might be times where, you know, the intimacy that you're being part of as well, there might be times where, you know, I'm not sure, but there might be something that's like a consensual non-consent type dynamic where, you know, afterwards it's like that kind of thing can have an impact when you're sort of in that energy and in that space with the actors. And then, you know, stepping out of that space, you know, it feels like there would need to be a lot of support there for you as well. So how, you know, how wonderful to have that connection and that support with other women when it's there, but also I'm sure it's so sensitive as far as NDAs.
Yeah, it is. And you have to have an exquisite kind of self toolkit where you're constantly, my teacher, I have an amazing teacher, and she talks about it as like pruning, you know, it's like taking the dead leaves off, and like understand, I have a movement practice, a very strong kind of embodiment practice where I do every day, and like grounding and centering and just activating my body and trying to, like, you know, this thing is incredibly smart and intelligent, but we operate from here so much. And my work is so energy, it's like an energy exchange. So you can come off set feeling completely depleted or completely activated, and you have to have the tools to protect yourself on set, because it's, as you know, as we were saying earlier, Liam, like the power dynamics, the people that you're working with, the egos, it's it can be very, very difficult to like remain centered and stay on the track that you're on. But women and the people, but you know, the people that I surround myself with and the incredible IC community, like it is an amazing asset to have that, and to be a part of something that you're building yourself as well. But yeah, NDAs are NDAs. I mean, Kat and I talk about everything because you have to have someone, you know, it's like, okay, I can't talk about the specific actor that I'm working with, but I can talk about what went on, because you need to, you know, in anything, you need to communicate and let it go.
To borrow a BDSM term, like the aftercare of a scene, you know, so you say that you have this kind of embodiment practice, but is there other things that you do for yourself at the end of a long day? Obviously, you're coming home to your partner, but you're also coming home to your child as well. I imagine it's probably an intense thing to balance, you know, family life and all this really intense kind of emotional space that you're holding for other people. And then you kind of would, I guess, get home, sit on the couch and go, holy shit, that was really intense.
What's amazing with what I do is I usually have to travel at least an hour and a half to 2 hours. So I have that decompression time to just either talk to Kat, and we'll often like have our carpool conversations where we just talk about the day. And that's been such an amazing thing, because it's just, it doesn't feel, it's not offloady. It's like I've taken responsibility for the day, and so is she, and we're just sharing, because I think sometimes you can get into that dynamic of like, I need to just offload onto you, and then that other person because of the nature of who they are, which is usually a very empathic, very kind of open human being, you're just sort of firing all this, and you need to have responsibility for your shit and for what went on, and then you can communicate that in whatever way you need to communicate it. But yeah, loads of things like breath work, all the stuff we know, some sort of, usually a shakedown, like shake it off. I'll often, if I'm on a set for a long period of time, so if I have like 2 or 3 weeks there and I'm traveling, I'll usually do like cold showers before the day and after the day, just to wash it away. Anything to kind of get me back in my body, because it can feel quite, as you said, Abby, like it's incredibly vulnerable. Also, because I'm an actor, because I've got a lot of movement practice, I'm often asked to show. And so you're then putting yourself through that physically, like how you physically sculpt something and doing all this sort of movement that is vulnerable. You're gyrating your hips, you're kind of showing how you do penetration, fake penetration. And you're doing all of this stuff in your own body. I remember I worked on a show and I was 8 months pregnant with Bobby, my daughter, and I had to do a fellatio scene, and the actress was like, could you just show me how to do it? And I'm usually completely fine with that. And I was like, of course. And I was in the back of a car and I was like, this massive bump. And I did it. And I remember I was like halfway through the action and I just could feel the warmth and the embarrassment on my face. And I was like, gosh, I'm embarrassed. And it was, of course, I'm pregnant. It's very vulnerable. Like you've got a lot going on internally. And I just kept, thank God it was dark, because I was like, oh God, I'm so red. But they, thank you so much. That was so helpful. And you're just like, yeah, okay. But that's, I had to really understand that was quite vulnerable for me. And I didn't show kind of throughout, I didn't want to show them how to do it throughout the rest of my pregnancy. Because I was like, it's not, if I'm embarrassed, you're going to feel that. And it's not rooted in, in positivity, but grounded in that. So it's quite interesting.
Obviously, you have these things that you do for yourself, but in terms of working with actors, right before a scene, do you go through exercises with them to kind of get them into a space where they feel comfortable being vulnerable? Are there particular things that you do, like a particular ritual maybe, that you work them through?
Yeah, absolutely. It's often usually somatic work. So we'll do some sort of breath work, some sort of, really, really understanding the body and feeling the body, and then getting the energy and the heart rate up. So whether it be like a shakedown or a stomp or something, just so that they feel in their bodies, so that they can be attuned to when something doesn't feel right. Obviously, again, each actor is different. So when you're working TV and film, it's difficult because you're like, can I bring this stuff here? Because I don't know if they're going to vibe it or they're very kind of internal, and everything can sometimes feel very heady and like from here up, and that's where they're shooting. Most actors you just offer it. You just say, do you want to do this? Or if you sense that a scene is not quite right, it's all a bit off, I will often say to the director, can I just have 5 minutes with them and just get them to just loosen up and shake down? And, sometimes you get blamed for the fact that actors don't have chemistry, and you have to kind of curate that somehow. And that's difficult. But you just sort of have to work off like really being really, really fine-tuning the choreography, and making sure that they know what they're doing. But sometimes that's difficult. And sometimes actors don't respond to any kind of physical work like that. So you have to just sort of cater it to the people that you're working with.
I was wondering about that, if the chemistry is not quite there and you're there sort of like the magic maker trying to, make sure everyone's comfortable. But then on the other hand, of course, that movie from back in the day, Love Actually, that famous scene where they're meeting and they're in that moment and they're like having the conversation and then they connect. Have you ever come across anything like that? Like through the work, actors have met in that space and then the chemistry is like very real beyond that acting moment.
Yes, it can happen. And your body is going through something, and your body doesn't always know that it's fake. In fact, it probably doesn't. And sensations will happen, and also people will get erections, and that's totally fine. It's just not great in a professional space. It's not appropriate. So you have to say to people, it is totally normal. We are animals. Our bodies are going to react to what is going on here. But if you feel something's happening, just take time out. It's cool. It's chill. You don't even have to let anyone know. Just take time out. because it does change the energy a bit, but you have to make sure that people don't feel shamed for that, and that it's actually okay that your body is reacting in a very normal way to a kiss or to a stroke or to whatever. But yes, you do. I mean, sometimes actors are like, pull you aside and say something's going on and I don't know how to handle it, and you just sort of think, I would love to help you here, but I have a professional boundary in place, and this is your personal life, and you guys need to work it out. Like I can absolutely put in place whatever needs to from a professional standpoint, and we can root this in character, and this is about character. But whatever you guys do outside of this experience, I can't help you with. Like it's difficult.
Wow. So it's like the actor will sometimes try and see if you can match make a little bit or get your opinion, being like, hang on, are we still acting or is this a real moment? Like something like that.
Or they'll be vulnerable enough to say, look, something's going on. It's a bit difficult to do this scene. I am going to find it quite difficult. So then you have to really root it in character. And you're like, they allude to something. They allude to the fact that they might like somebody, and you have to be very private with it and very kind of confidential, because that other actor might not know, but sometimes they do. They feel that they can tell you. And so then you have to hold that. You have to hold that vulnerability. You have to hold that kind of, I guess that generosity of information, but keep it professional, because otherwise you end up being, they're sort of therapist, and that's not my job. I also don't have the skills to help them through that.
Oh my gosh, I feel like that would be me. I would be in the scene getting the crush and like having all of the feels, and I'd be like, Elle, I really like this person. Can we like renegotiate what we're doing? I want to make out for longer.
You're rolling, don't cut.
Don't cut. Let's just continue on. Liam's shaking his head.
Yeah, I'd imagine they'd be like, "Oh, do you reckon you can ask them for a coffee? Like, maybe we could keep this going." It is such a remarkable thing. Like, even just talking to for an hour, like it's clear that having someone like you or your business partner, who I'm sure is incredible as well, on set is only a positive thing. There isn't really an argument for having this beautiful protective person in the space, kind of coordinating this intimacy and coordinating these beautiful vulnerabilities, because ultimately you'd be able to read that on screen. Like, as you were saying before, you can really tell if an actor or actress is genuinely uncomfortable. And I imagine even when you're in the room, you're watching the scene and you've got a mind also thinking, what's it going to look like in the edit? Being from an acting background, of course, like that's part of your job, I'd imagine, as well, is thinking, okay, well, this kind of looks a bit awkward in the room, and I can sense that there's a bit of awkwardness here, but I know it's going to translate incredibly once the editor gets a hold on this, and it's going to look great on the big screen.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really funny is when you've done 5 takes and the masturbation has not worked in the first 4, but you've got this incredible moment where actually all of the angles are right, all of the movement is right, all of the sensations, the simulated sensations or real sensations are right, and then they don't pick that in the edit, and you're like, that was the one. That was you've now got the penis looking, it's like completely at the wrong angle, and you've chosen that. Why have you done that? So frustrating.
Because I imagine the way that you now consume, like when you go to the theater, or even if you're have an interest in consuming pornography or something like that, it would really change your relationship to how you view intimacy on screen. I feel like I'm a musician, and often when I go to a concert, I'm sitting in the audience just analyzing, oh, that's how they did that. That's that chord change. That's, this is how they did that. Are you also doing that? Like, if you watch porn, or if you're, watching a movie, you're thinking, oh, that's a bad angle. They should have really shot that from the other way. And, the second camera, the B camera should have caught that.
All the time, Liam. And I don't know if Abby, but my partner George is just like, can you please? Because I'll do it out loud, and he's just trying to engage in the film or the TV series, and he's just like, well, I'm out of it now. I'm like, I can't watch anything with you. You're so annoying. I'm like, well, I know, sorry. But it's just it's almost automatic. You just sort of think, oh, it's the best when, I love this, when you don't know how. You're like, how did they do that? That is just sublime. And that, it's so you're like, they must be really doing it, and then you realize that they're not. And it's just because I feel, and I don't know if you feel this with being a musician, like you're very rarely surprised anymore when you work in these industries, because It's no, the magic is out of it because you do it every day. But then when you are completely absorbed and transfixed and transformed by a moment of intimacy, and that can come from a hug, like the most incredible hug that you've ever seen, or just the way in which someone looks at somebody. I don't know, like, and that is the joy of the edit, because sometimes an actor will sense or feel something because of what you've done, but the editor has picked it up in a way and put it and positioned it in the scene out of context of what you actually shot, but actually it informs that moment so much. It's beautiful. But yeah, the more surprised I am, the more exciting things are, you know.
Sometimes with your intimacy coordination work, is it sometimes it's not always sort of sexual based, it's just intimacy in other ways, or if there are age differences happening in a show and just how to approach the dynamics? Like I'm sure it's not always sort of a sexual intimacy.
Absolutely. So we, when we look at scripts, we'll break down all moments of intimacy. So that comes from obviously your big scenes, so your simulated sex scenes. It comes from your simulated masturbation, whatever, and then you have like domestic touch. So sometimes I find some of the most interesting ones to work on is where you've got a father-daughter or a mother-son or familial relationships, which are integral to believe. And sometimes I'm like, those actors it hasn't been handled well, because that touch doesn't feel like a father's touch. That actor is uncomfortable because he is working with a child who's not their child. There's so much, and on set, obviously, you can't curate, but you have to fake it. But also, you have to be careful with the way in which you touch. So, working on with older actors, with younger actors, on like what is the quality of that touch? Like, how do we make that realistic? How do we ensure that little performer is completely happy with the touch that you're giving them? Because sometimes, you know, the power dynamic for a little actor coming on, you know, a 5-year-old, they don't necessarily know how to communicate no, or I don't want that, especially if they're in this environment that's very exciting and very kind of glamorous or whatever. So they're really fascinating scenes to work on. Or if you've got, I worked on a show with, you know, a young actor who had a disability, and it's, you know, her body, working out what her boundaries of her body were, and the character that she was playing also had a disability. So it's like, okay, what touch are you happy with? There was a lot of kind of moving in and out of a wheelchair and stuff like that, and she's also somebody that is moved in and out of wheelchair. So it's so complex and nuanced, and just a little touch can really impact somebody. So yeah, those scenes are a challenge, because sometimes they don't give you enough space for them, because they're like, well, it's just a touch, like it's a domestic touch. But actually, that is a really great selling point, to believe that is a family, that they do this every day, that kind of touch is something that happens all the time, and when it doesn't, because you've just met each other and we're just doing this scene now, so it's difficult. But they're really interesting ones to work on, those scenes.
So do you feel that in the kind of, if you're looking 10 years into the future with intimacy coordinators, it's almost, I guess, even in 10 years into the future, that's going to, you know, triple the amount of time that or double the amount that intimacy coordinators have actually been a thing. What ways do you think that it may shift in terms of an industry standard and the way in which you approach your roles? Do you think there's going to be any changes as time goes on?
Just by the very nature of what we're seeing in terms of what's being curated now, I think audiences are they're not stupid. They're incredibly smart. And we're just not willing. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but we've cancelled so many subscriptions in the last couple of months, because there's nothing on television. And, you know, you spend so much of your time, which is awful. Like, we don't connect, we watch. We just numb out by watching things, and it's not good. And I say this from someone that has been doing that for, you know, quite a long time, just like getting to the end of the day and putting on something. And you just think, no, this is a moment that we could be intimate in this moment, not necessarily just sexually, but like, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about things as opposed to consume constantly. And so I think there is a shift. I sense this shift of actually, what are we creating? What are we curating? What are we making? What is the content that is going to be made? In terms of intimacy, and, you know, I've had some really interesting conversations about what, you know, especially with actors who have been very kind of hypersexualized in their career. And they're now at a point where they're like, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm done. I've finished. I don't want to do any more sex scenes. And so asking, talking about that, like what kind of intimacy do you want to see on screen? And is there going to be less sex scenes, or is there a space where the sex scenes are more, I don't know, like more explicit? Are we going to go in even further direction? Like what's going to happen with the sex scenes? But I think ultimately what will happen in terms of our work, I'm hoping that, and it's already starting to happen, intimacy coordinators are being asked into writers' rooms to really, really think about what kind of sex scenes we're writing, and like to really kind of interrogate those plot points in stories where we use intimacy as another form of communication, because the body communicates, and I think that's the most fascinating thing. Like, how does your body communicate? Not just by what you say, but by what you do. But I think there's more space to, at the minute, you just, as from my practice anyway, you go in and you facilitate a safe space or a creatively safe space, and you help with the director's vision, and you sometimes have the creative license to do what you want to do, but it's all in keeping with what is on the script. However, I think in time there will be more rooms where we can have conversation about sexual expression, even with what you guys are doing. There's so many more amazing platforms where people are talking about sex, and whether that be non-monogamy or monogamy or heterosexual or bisexuality or whatever, like we're talking about it because I think there's a general interest, a huge boom. I know it happened, it has been happening for a long time, but we're interrogating our sexual expression. And I think it's because our body and our minds are suddenly starting to talk to each other, and we're not so severed at the neck. Like, embodiment is becoming a massive kind of thing. What we do physically, how we express physically, is incredibly interesting for human beings to not only observe but to be a part of. So I think it'll evolve in amazing ways that I'm sure we can't even imagine now.
Well, Elle, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It's been a real gift to be able to kind of converse with someone who is having such an influential, the ways in which you're improving the industry just by being so aware of such important things such as consent, and thinking so beautifully about it, and being that safe space in those places where people can be vulnerable. It's a real gift, not only for us to have this conversation, but also for the people who get to be on the sets that you are on as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. That was very kind.
And if people would like to find out more about your work, what is the best way for people to find out?
I am notoriously crap on any social media, but I'm getting better. I am on Instagram and my website as well. So Instagram is Elle.McAlpine and our website is ekintimacy.com. That's probably the best places, I reckon.
Incredible. Well, we're so looking forward to following your career and watching all of these beautiful scenes that you have been part of holding the space for. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. You've been a treat.
Thanks for tuning in to the Evolving Love podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback and support fuels our passion, and together we're building a community of curiosity, kindness, and growth.
If you would like to show your support and are interested in accessing 2 extra podcast episodes each month, along with access to my exclusive writing, you can become a premium subscriber over at evolvingloveproject.substack.com. Subscribe, comment, and let's keep the conversation going.